psychiatrist chair question. Tell us about your family background and how that might have influenced what you've ended up doing.
Well, nothing in my family background presupposed me to become an activist of any kind. My family were working class, conservative, evangelical Christians. Our whole family life revolved around the church. For my parents, homosexuality was deemed to be a sin, almost on a par with rape or murder. They had no social engagement whatsoever. The only thing I would say is that my father, who was a factory worker, he worked in an engineering factory, he was a lathe operator. He was a lifelong Labour supporter, but socially very conservative. And I never really saw much of him because he was mostly doing night shift work to get a decent livable wage. So, he was sleeping during the day and off at night, so I didn't see much of him at all. My parents were divorced when I was 4. My mother later remarried. My stepfather turned to be a monster, abusive towards my mother and towards me in particular. He hated the fact that I was smart, that I was getting an education. He ruled the house like a tyrant. He was very, very violently abusive. Once he swung an axe at my head in a rage, and if I hadn't ducked, other times I had to go and live for a while with my auntie while he was going berserk. It was very, very tough. For me, school was an escape. Yeah. It was a safe place where I could be myself. I did very well academically. I was quite good at sport. But I remember that towards around the age of 14, 15, 16, other pupils used to joke, calling me Pufter Pete or Peter Pansy. But they were my friends. It wasn't meant in maliciously, but of course I was convinced I was straight. I was dating girls.
Okay, so I was going to ask you, when did you know that you were gay?
Not until I was 17. I had such a sheltered life. The only concept I had of a homosexual was a dirty old man in a Mac who molests young boys. So that was the only reference point I had, but I had to leave home at 16 because neither my father nor stepfather would support me to carry on at school, even though I was academically very good. They wanted me to go out and earn money to support the family. And that meant that I had to find a job, and my passion was art and design. Not having the funding to go to university or art school, I thought, well, what kind of job can I do that I might get into that kind of field? So I went to work in one of Melbourne's biggest department stores in the art and design department, doing interiors, windows, logos, sign writing. That's where I learnt skills on the job. And as you can imagine, about half the staff in that department were gay. And they were young people like me, creative, intelligent, kind, handsome. It completely changed my perception of what a gay man was. And one of the slightly older staff members, I was 17, he was 21. I thought there was a huge gap. He used to joke at the end of the day, "You're coming home for dinner tonight?" And I knew what that meant, so I said no. But then after a while, I began to wonder. I dated girls, but I'd never felt any sexual desires. And if I had, I wouldn't have acted on them because as a good Christian boy, that was a no-no, sex before marriage. So one day, I think after he'd been doing this probably for 3 months, we were about to go home and he said, "Do you want to come in for dinner?" And I suddenly said yes. He almost fell off his chair. We went to go home and we waited at the tram stop in Collins Street, Melbourne, and who should be at the same tram stop as my mother? So I introduced them and I said, "Look, I'm going to go and stay at Robert's house tonight. It's no point me going to his house for dinner and then going all the way out to Mount Waverley, far out in the suburbs. I'll stay there overnight. Is that okay? And she said, of course it's okay. Have a nice time.
So you secured her blessing.
Yeah, and I can remember he had a little bed sit right on the beach at Middle Park, looking out over Port Phillip Bay. We had a lovely dinner at the window with, I can't remember if it's dolphins or porpoises darting in and out of the water. You can't imagine anything more romantic. Then afterwards we had sex. Because I thought, well, the only way to decide if I'm gay or not is to try it. And so we did, and I remember lying back in my bed that night with Robert in my arms and thinking to myself, if this is what gay is, I am definitely gay.
Sounds perfect.
I had no shame, no guilt, no doubt whatsoever, despite my incredibly strict religious upbringing. Wow. And, within 2 or 3 months, I was starting to think, well, I've been campaigning against Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War, against the death penalty, for Black Australian rights. Now it's time for me to campaign for LGBT plus rights. But in those days in Melbourne, there were no LGBT plus organisations, no helplines, no switchboards, and definitely no campaign groups. So among the few gay friends I knew at work and through other networks, I said to them, let's set up a gay organisation, because at this time in Melbourne, homosexuality was totally illegal. You could be sentenced to several years imprisonment, and even in some circumstances, forced to undergo compulsory psychiatric treatment in a mental hospital. I said, this is outrageous. We have to do something. We can't allow ourselves to be treated like this. Now their response was, you're 17, what do you know? Go away, you'll get us all arrested. So all I could do at that time was write letters to the press or to MPs, but I was too scared to sign my name. It took me probably 4 or 5 months to sign my name, didn't give them address, just the name, and then probably another 3 or 4 months to actually write my name and address, because I feared a policeman's knock at the door.
Yeah, which was a very real threat, wasn't it? So you were doing all that amazing work in Australia when it was unlawful to be gay, and then you came to London. What drew you to London? Because London at that time wasn't an easy place either, was it? I mean, in 1960...
Compared to Australia, it was.
Oh, yeah. Well, okay, 67 was obviously, a really important point in the liberalisation of gay relationships. But what drew you to London, really?
Well, right from a very early age, I was always questioning, asking. My parents used to call me a very curious boy.
That wasn't a euphemism.
I remember saying to my parents, why did people allow Hitler to come to power? Why didn't they do something? And I'd read a little bit about the history. I knew that all the warning signs were there in the late 20s and early 30s. And nobody could answer. And I remember saying to myself, if any bad thing happens, I won't ignore it. I won't be like my parents and just look the other way and make lame excuses. I will try and do something. So that was the motivation.
That's their influence, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So back to your question, I mean, I was always fascinated by other people and other cultures. I always found history really interesting. Had a great thirst and yearning for knowledge. So I can't remember the name of the magazine. I used to get, we were very poor, but I did a sort of newspaper rounds and other things. And I could afford this weekly or monthly magazine, which is all about facts and knowledge about, the highest waterfall in the world, what happened in 1789 or 1633. And I was really, really interested in other people, other cultures and different ways of living, and also obsessed with the poverty of people in developing countries. I thought, how can this be allowed to happen? We live in this world of immense wealth in some countries and immense poverty in others. So I'd always wanted to travel. But the real impetus was because Australia was fighting in Vietnam alongside the Americans. And although I was brainwashed into believing the war was a just war against communism, at the instigation of my American history teacher, I read some books and read the truth about what really happened in Vietnam and how the Vietnamese were fighting with us in the Second World War against Japanese imperialism. And then, as soon as the war was over, we stabbed them in the back and blocked free and fair elections in 1954. So that got me involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement. And at the time, there was also the draft for Vietnam. And I saw this war as being unjust and immoral. I wasn't going to be any part of it. So I was going to refuse to register for the draft. But that carried a penalty of 2 years imprisonment. And Robert, who I went home with that night, we were in love, we were in a relationship, we moved in together. At that early stage in our relationship, the idea of being apart from him for 2 years was too much for me to bear. So we decided to come to London, and it was only going to be a temporary stay until the war was over, until amnesty was granted, which it was in 1974. But by that time, I got involved in the Gay Liberation Front. I went back to night class and did my A-levels. I got a good job, also doing shop design and windows. So just over time, the temporary stay drifted and became permanent.
Well, I'm glad you stayed. You got very involved, and you just mentioned it, in the Gay Liberation Front. And I just saw this amazing quote, because it was hugely important in terms of LGBT history. The GLF was a glorious, enthusiastic, and often chaotic mix of anarchists, hippies, left-wingers, feminists, liberals, and counter-culturalists. Was it really that wonderful?
It was. It was being part of a revolution. The Gay Liberation Front was a revolution in consciousness, not just for straight people, but for queer people as well. You know, we had a simple 3-word slogan, gay is good. That was revolutionary in 1970, 71.
Tell everybody, those who weren't actively involved in 1974, and I was still at school, by the way, just so you know. But it was really important, and the GLF was incredibly important. What were they achieving, and why was it important in terms of anti-gay discrimination at that time?
Like, the first most important thing was, one of our slogans was, gay is good, which turned on its head the history of homophobia, which said that gay was bad, mad, and sad. So this was a complete break with millennia of homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. Another slogan was, come out wherever you are. We said the single most important thing that any LGBT plus person can do is to come out, to lift the burden of hiding, and to show and be a witness to your family, your friends, your work colleagues, your neighbors, because we knew that straight people who know an LGBT plus person are much more understanding and accepting and much more likely to support equality. So coming out was so important. And the Gay Liberation Front was the instrument by which, for the first time in British history, not hundreds, but tens of thousands of LGBT plus people came out. It had never happened before, but we gave people a sense the days of victimhood are over. Stand tall, proud, and defiant. Don't accept things as they are. Fight to change things and make them better.
And that was a very brave approach, wasn't it, in 1974?
Yeah, I mean, the scale of police harassment was it was just off the scale. And queer bashing violence was rife. You rarely got police protection if you were a victim of it. You got sacked from your job if you're, not everybody, but a lot of people got sacked from their jobs if they came out and were openly gay. Landlords could legally evict you from their property. It was tough and brave to be out in those days. But we just, and I say we, the collectivity of the Gay Liberation Front, we just had this vision that nothing would ever change unless we made it change. And I can't speak for everybody in the Gay Liberation Front, but I certainly took my model for activism from the suffragettes and the Black Civil Rights Movement in America. I applied their tactics of nonviolent direct action to the struggle for LGBT plus freedom.
But the GLF wrapped up. It established those incredible foundations, but then it wrapped up in '74. Why did it wrap up?
There were a whole host of reasons. I mean, direct action groups are very hard to sustain in the long term when you don't have an office or a staff or funding. That's part of it. Also, I think the Gay Liberation Front was the seed of many initiatives which people left to be part of. So it established icebreakers, the first counselling service by and for LGBT plus people, positive, affirmative, uplifting. It established the first ever gay newspaper in this country, Gay News, a vital means of communication. We sat down and we thought, if we want to build a community, because a community didn't really exist in those days, we have to have a means of communication. We have to inform people about what's going on and mobilize them to act, to become active participants in the struggle. Not just us in GLF, but all of us together. It also led to the formation of multiple GLF groups across the country. So in towns and cities all across Britain, they were seeded by activists going out and working with local people to set up parallel groups to work within their local communities. The whole issue of the medicalization of homosexuality, there was a counter-psychiatry group that worked to challenge the medical profession, the psychiatric profession, to change their mentality. The other big factor, I think, was that then some of us also saw the importance of going into mainstream politics to make sure that political parties embrace these issues.
So you've anticipated my next question, which was, building upon those foundations, you went into the Labour Party. What was the Labour Party like, given the landscape that you just described at that time? It wasn't entirely easy, was it?
The Labour Party in those days was pretty homophobic, and most political parties were. The Liberals had adopted, I think, gay rights policy in 1973, but they were alone and an outlier. So many of us saw the importance of going into political parties to change that either indifference or hostility. And yeah, it was tough to try and get LGBT plus resolutions through local Labour Party branches was very hard. Some people succeeded. I'd pay tribute at this moment to Alan Horsfall, one of our great pioneers in the 1950s. He got an LGBT plus rights resolution through his local Labour Party in Bolton, I think in 1958. That was absolutely exceptional, and he had to fight and fight and fight against other Labour Party members who tried to block it.
But nevertheless, however difficult, through your charm and through your tactics, you became the preferred candidate for Bermondsey. And I talked a little bit about how tough it was. How did you survive? Because I remember it being this shocking moment when we had, some of us knew that you were gay, and homophobia was the central plank of the opposition to you. How did you cope, and how did you feel?
Well, of course, I stood on a broad left-wing program, including LGBT plus rights. I think probably the first mainstream political candidate to positively speak out for LGBT plus rights in a by-election or a general election. But I was much more than that. Like, I argued for things like a national minimum wage back in 1983. And even the Labour Party told me, shut up. That is not our Labour Party policy. It's too extreme. It's unacceptable. I argued for a comprehensive Equalities Act to protect everyone against discrimination. I was told, you cannot say that. You cannot say that. That's not Labour Party policy. You must not mention that again.
But you worked within the system.
Yeah.
What I'm interested in...
Can I just tell you, it's just,
yeah, go ahead.
When I was finally adopted as a Labour candidate, I had to go to the Labour Party head office to meet Monica Foote, who was then the press officer for the Labour Party, to get my marching orders from the Labour Party. I walked into the room, she smiled and sat me down. The first question she asked was, do you mess with little boys? Are you a kiddie fiddler? That's the homophobia of the Labour Party back in those days. Now, I'm not saying all Labour Party people were like that, but that was what I was up against. In a normal by-election, Labour put in 80 to 90 full-time organisers. I got 12. And, you know, throughout the whole campaign, I was being sabotaged left, right and centre. But it was primarily not because I was gay, but because I was standing for radical left-wing policies.
So how did you cope?
It was very, very tough.
Yeah. Because this was on the front page of the news every night as well.
Yeah. So I was selected in November 1981 as the Labour candidate. 3 weeks later, I was denounced and blocked by Michael Foot and the Labour National Executive Committee, banned as a candidate, one of the few people up until that point in history who had been.
But you bounced back.
Huh?
You bounced back.
Oh, I bounced back, yeah. But so I had to fight for 50, or the local, not me, but the local party, Bermondsey Party, had to fight for 15 months to affirm their right to choose their candidate. And I was then reselected. And when I was reselected, the Labour Party realised the party isn't going to cave in, they better accept me. But it was tough. I think there were over 30 attacks upon my flat, mostly bricks and bottles through the windows, queer daubed on my front door, a bullet posted through the letterbox in the middle of the night, more than 100 attacks when I was out canvassing, 2 attempts to run me down in vans or cars. It was like living through a low-level civil war. You know, I've got to tell you, I was terrified. I was terrified, but what kept me going was the amazing support I had from not only the Bermondsey Party, but from constituency parties across the country. That their support willed me to keep going. And yeah, I mean, I was many times thought about, should I move house? The police advised me to move house. They said, your life is potentially in danger. But I thought to myself, well, if I move, that's a victory for the bigots. It's a victory for those who are trying to terrorize me. So I boarded up the windows and installed a rope ladder to escape out the back, put a fire blanket in the hallway, a fire extinguisher, a bucket of water in the hallway. Anyway.
It was scary, and those of us who were looking on were scared on your behalf, but also for ourselves, because you were in the public eye, and for the rest of us, this was incredibly intimidating. One of the questions that I'd like to ask you, Peter, is, had you been successful, what would your career in mainline, frontline politics have been like? What do you think?
I always used to say that I'd probably end up being a troublesome backbench Labour MP. But then some friends in more recent years have said, well, that's what Jeremy Corbyn ended up being, but he later went on to become leader of the Labour Party. I don't think I would have accepted a cabinet post under Tony Blair, but who knows? But I wouldn't have stayed in that position, you know,
no, it's just,
over the Iraq War and many other things.
Yeah, but it's interesting that given that defeat, you then went on to be one of the founders of Outrage, which was incredibly successful in some of the ways that I have just described. Was it a reaction to Bermondsey and your treatment and, you know, your general frustration with mainline politics that led to the direct action approach of Outrage?
I think the incredible homophobia of the Bermondsey by-election, which many commentators have said was the dirtiest most violent and definitely most homophobic election in Britain since 1945, my reaction was the scale of homophobia was so great, it just reinforced to me the importance of championing that cause. Not to the exclusion of other issues that I campaigned on, but it revealed a seam or undercurrent of extreme homophobia. And I felt I just had put more effort into that. So that's what I did, and that's part of the reason why Outrage was formed. And again, Outrage was sort of the Gay Liberation Front Mark II, also inspired by the direct action model of nonviolence.
And direct action was a complete response to what had happened in Bermondsey, and presumably felt very empowering because you did some pretty brave things like trying to arrest Mugabe, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that for me, none of the protests were an end in itself. They were all a means to an end. And the means to the end was, by doing a protest, you challenge those in power who have often been unchallenged and unquestioned. But importantly, if you do a spectacular or funny or a clever protest, you get media coverage. And through media coverage, you raise public awareness. And through raising public awareness, you help change hearts and minds. So off the back of protests by the Gay Liberation Front or Outrage, there'll be media coverage which straight people would suddenly become aware, oh, LGBT people can be sacked from their jobs, can be denied housing. Lesbian mothers can have their kids taken off them. And so that generates a debate. And then, of course, we carried it on by doing radio and TV phone-in programs. And that raised more awareness. And by that process, you build understanding and eventual acceptance of the need for change. And the rationale in my mind was always, politicians are usually too cowardly to take risks. So we have to show them that public opinion is changing. And so if we can change public opinion, then we can go to politicians and say, it's safe to change the law. So with outrageous campaigns in the early 1990s, by the mid-1990s, a majority of the public was in favor of an equal age of consent. A majority of the public was against the ban on LGBT plus people in the armed forces. So armed with those opinion polls, we went to the government, I think Stonewall did too, to say, public opinion is on side, you can now have the confidence to change the law.
Because one of the things we've glided over, and it was an incredibly important factor in what Outrage was doing and what Stonewall was doing, was Section 28, because that was a real turning point which Margaret Thatcher had never anticipated, where right-thinking people were outraged on behalf of the LGBT community about how homophobia was entrenched in law. And that was a really key factor, wasn't it, for Outrage? What did you make of Stonewall? Because we were in parallel. We were both a response to Section 28, and we were doing things differently. We were a group of lawyers and actors who were drafting legislation and trying to work in a very polite way, and you were doing something that was rather different. Go on, tell us. I'm holding my seat.
Well, back in the days of the Gay Liberation Front, there was the equivalent of Stonewall in that day, the campaign for homosexual equality. And then in the Outrage days, there was Stonewall. I study history. I didn't learn all this activism by myself. I looked at how historical change has been brought about. And history shows you need insiders working within the system, and you need troublemakers on the outside to shake things up. So you needed both the suffragettes on the outside and the suffragists on the inside. And that's really, I suppose, the Stonewall Outrage relationship. You were the insiders, we were the outsiders. We were creating the chaos and momentum, which enabled Stonewall to say to government, you don't have to deal with those nasty outrage people. Come to us and have a cup of tea.
And that's exactly what we did.
But the other thing I would say, there was a slight difference in approach. Stonewall was very much concerned with legal equality and the parliamentary process. Outrage, like GLF before, was much more wider and broader. We were taking on the church, the media, the education system, the armed forces, all the bad people, you know. It wasn't just about parliamentary reform. Moreover, we did have an agenda beyond equality. So, for example, on the age of consent, of course we supported equality, but based on the research at the time, which showed that a majority of young people have their first sexual experience around the age of 14, we thought it was wrong in outrage. We thought it was wrong that young people aged 14 to 16 should be criminalized. So that's why we proposed an age of consent of 14, providing there's no more than 2 or 3 years difference in the ages. So that would not criminalize young people of similar ages, but still protect them against exploitation by those much older, which, as I'm sure you all know, has been massively misrepresented for years by the far right and now embraced by anti-trans activists and anybody else who's against progress.
We were busy having tea and talking and drafting legislation, and you were also calling out hypocrisy, and you just mentioned the church. I mean, you were very public in calling out hypocrisy in the church, but also in relation to people in positions of public profile. Tell everybody about that.
Well, of course, I was quite well suited to it because of my devout Christian upbringing. I was a Sunday school teacher at the age of 15 and 16. So one of the things that drew me into activism was a number of things. Well, first of all, I grew up in the 1960s. The pivotal influence on my life was the bombing of a black church in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963 by white racists who murdered 4 young girls about my own age. I was only 11 years old, thousands of miles away, but I knew instantly that was so wrong. So that led me to avidly follow and support from afar the struggle of black Americans. I saw the struggle for voting rights and an end to segregation as being a just struggle, and indeed a Christian struggle. It was led by a Baptist pastor, Dr. Martin Luther King. And of course, my family background was in the church. My parents, for them, Christianity was all about personal repentance, women not wearing lipstick, not swearing, not drinking, not having gay sex. But for me, I took the Sermon on the Mount literally. I took it literally, be a good Samaritan, love thy neighbor as thyself. So I can remember when I was 17 and realized I was gay, I didn't have a reference point in Australia. There was no LGBT plus organization. So I looked to the Black Civil Rights Movement as the model. And I looked to their ideals, their values, and the way they did things. I can remember thinking to myself, if African Americans are an oppressed minority, so too are LGBT plus people. We're an oppressed minority too, and we also deserve equal rights. And in 1969, looking at the history of the Black Civil Rights Movement, I calculated it would probably take about 50 years to win LGBT plus equality in Western countries like Australia, Britain, and the United States. And that was just a speculative guesstimate, but it sort of turned out almost right.
And back to the church, you called out the hypocrisy and threatened to out people, and that was pretty effective, wasn't it? Because everyone ran scared.
Yeah, my great regret is that I did not use outing earlier.
And it was very controversial at the time, wasn't it?
Absolutely. But I just reiterate to all of you, neither I nor Outrage, we never outed anyone because they were gay and in the closet. We were targeting church leaders and politicians who were hypocrites and homophobes. They were preaching against homosexuality while having private gay sex. So it was their hypocrisy and homophobia. And we gave them warning. We made it clear that if you don't stop persecuting LGBT plus people, we will name you. And none of them believed that we would ever dare do it. But in the case of 10 Anglican bishops, we did. And as I said, they were not named because they were gay and in the closet. It's because they were part of a church that was actively harming LGBT plus people. At the time, the church's official policy, spoken by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. George Carey, was that homosexuals are sinners and must repent, that homosexuality is inferior to heterosexuality, and that therefore the law should discriminate. So he was actively lobbying members of Parliament to vote against equality. He said there shouldn't be an equal age of consent, same-sex couples should not be allowed to foster or adopt children, employers in certain circumstances should have a right to refuse to hire or sack LGBT plus people, there should be no recognition of same-sex relationships in law. And when he wouldn't meet with us, in 8 years, outrage went to his cathedral in 1998, and we didn't interrupt the sacred parts of the service, but we did, when he began his sermon, walk up into the pulpit and denounce his support for discrimination. And I, in my childhood Christian tradition, preached an alternative sermon that discrimination is not a Christian value.
Wow. We've made huge progress, and we won't go through how we achieved that and what we achieved. But actually, one of the other things I wanted to touch on was the work you've done in relation to pardons post partial decriminalisation. Can you tell everybody about that, particularly the recent work in relation to police forces? Because I think, in a way, everyone assumed that with legal equality, and I'm completely with you on this, Peter, that the fight was over, the job was done, we were going to make cultural change happen, job over. That wasn't the case, was it?
Just to give you one snapshot, I think you're all aware of the Dennis Nielsen murders of gay and bisexual men in the 1970s and early 80s. After that, I and others, we sat down with the police to agree a protocol that if there were circumstances that pointed to a serial killer, or even just one murder of LGBT plus people, they should liaise with our community, that we should be involved, that we should use our own resources to help the police catch the killers and stop further murders. That was agreed in the early 1980s. Then, in the 1980s, in the latter part, we had the Michael Lupo serial killings. The police completely ignored those protocols. Then in the 1990s, we had the Colin Ireland murders. Again, the police completely ignored those protocols. Meanwhile, gay and bisexual men were being murdered. And then, as recently as 2014-15, we had the Stephen Port murders. Again, the protocols completely ignored. And now we have this case of the gay student Ed Corns, whose investigation into his death by the police has been shambolic from start to finish. His poor, grieving mother still hasn't got answers from the police. They won't even give her the internal inquiry the police themselves did. It's just so shocking. I'm not saying that all police are bad. There are many good officers. And, we do need the police to protect us. But this repeated failure, it's so heartbreaking when you think of the lives lost because of police incompetence and, in some cases, prejudice.
And you've managed to persuade 21 police authorities to apologise, haven't you?
21 chief constables.
Chief constable.
Yeah, have formally apologised, with most of them also enacting new LGBT plus policies, like appointing LGBT plus community liaison officers for the first time, setting up homophobic, biphobic and transphobic hotlines, establishing community forums within the police and LGBT plus communities. It's been really, really heartening for those who have, but 24 still haven't and probably won't. I'll just tell you one example. The Chief Constable of Liverpool, Merseyside, she responded. She took her a while to respond, but that was really worth it, because when she did make her response, she called an open public meeting in Liverpool where she brought victims of police harassment and persecution to come and speak and tell their stories in front of her senior officers and the wider public. That was an amazing, courageous, brave thing to do. And it has really inspired the local LGBT community to feel much more trustworthy and trusting and confident about the police because they took that step.
That's real leadership, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
What's left to do on the LGBT plus front?
Well,
We haven't talked about trans rights, and
Yeah.
Clearly you believe in free speech, and sometimes you've been accused of giving a platform to transphobia, but I know you're completely committed to eradicating transphobia. What's your view? I mean, we're living in really difficult, I mean, you mentioned it, dangerous times.
well, I'd say that still homophobic, biphobic and transphobic hate crime is a problem in this country. It's not as bad as it was. Thankfully, more people are reporting it. And mostly, not always, mostly the police are responding better. That's good. But it still is a problem. You know, lesbian couples get beaten up on buses, even in London. You know, gay men get bashed outside gay clubs. That is still an issue. That is unacceptable in a democratic society where people live in fear and become victims of violence. Also, of course, we've been waiting for, how many years is it? 8 years of promises to ban conversion practices. It still ain't happened. In the 2024 election, Labour promised in its manifesto to ban LGBT plus conversion therapies. They haven't even got a draft bill before Parliament, not even a timetable. It's just so insulting. Meanwhile, people are still being subjected to these vicious, nasty, oppressive and damaging, harmful practices, mostly in religious settings. Now, it just seems to me that the government's too afraid to take on religious bigots. Now, not all people of faith are bigots, no way. But those that are do need to be challenged, not appeased. Back to your point about trans people, yeah, I mean, this toxic culture war around trans issues, it reminds me of, you know, the 1970s and 80s for LGBs. You know, it's very similar, very similar. The vilification, the demonization, the exaggeration, the generalization. It's profoundly shocking, profoundly shocking. But I say to every trans and non-binary person, you will win in the end because you have right and justice on your side. You know, this is tough, this is painful, this is awful, but you will win in the end. And what I find particularly shocking is the way in which the anti-trans rhetoric and vilification is empowering and enabling the far right. Anybody who is anti-trans must surely be worried that their talking points are being embraced by far-right extremists and religious fundamentalists. If Donald Trump and others, Nigel Farage, are echoing those talking points, that ought to be a cause to wake you up and think, is that really right? How can you justify this? You know, we just have to stand in solidarity with our trans siblings, stand with them, support them, challenge transphobia wherever we see it.
Yeah. In terms of the work you've done beyond LGBT plus rights, one of the, I think, outstanding moments was the work you did on civil partnerships for opposite sex partners. Because a number of us thought it was job done in terms of same-sex partners, but you were pretty persistent and successful in relation to that. Talk us through perhaps your commitment to wider human rights using that as an example, because I think that was a great example of logic and fairness that lots of people weren't prepared to push for.
Yeah, right from the get-go, myself and others in Outrage, we saw the enactment of civil partnerships as a step forward, short of marriage equality, not equality, but a step in the right direction. But we thought compounding the exclusion of LGBT plus people from marriage with an exclusion of straight people from civil partnerships, two wrongs don't make a right. If we want to win the support of straight people, we have to stand with them having equal parity as well. And so for us, it was really important that we championed both equal marriage for everyone and equal civil partnerships for everyone. For those of you who don't know, Outrage actually began the first major challenge to marriage inequality back in 1992, when 5 of our same-sex couples filed applications for civil marriage at Marylebone Register Office. It was a very comical situation. It went in and applied for the applications from the registrar. She said, no, you can't marry, it's banned in the Marriage Act. And of course, we knew it wasn't. The 1949 Marriage Act does not state that marriage partners have to be male and female. It simply says 2 persons. So when this was pointed out to the registrar, she had this horrific look on her face. She scurried away, phoned the Home Office, and then, of course, they told her that this exclusion was introduced in the Nullity of Marriage Act in the 1970s. So the ban on same-sex marriage has only existed from the early 1970s until the repeal or to the new Marriage Act came into force in 2013-14. So that battle for civil marriage began way back in 1992. And I've got to say that no one, apart from the Lesbian and Gay Christian movement, the Lesbian and Gay Humanist Association, and that's about it, supported same-sex marriage back in 1992. We were complete outliers. Even in the LGBT plus community, people said, this is a step too far. You're way too far ahead.
Yeah, we're all too cautious.
Yeah. We said, it's about equality. You want equality? Let's have it. Anyway, back in 2010, I set up with colleagues from Outrage the Equal Love campaign, which had the twin campaigns of equal marriage and equal civil partnerships. And we got 4 same-sex couples and 4 opposite-sex couples to file applications in their local registrar offices. When they were refused, they then took their case to the European Court of Human Rights. Astonishingly, after being, I suppose, reminded again and again for a judgment, a ruling, they dismissed the case without even giving a reason, even though it's required under the European Convention on Human Rights. But before then, we'd apprised David Cameron. We've been liaising with George Osborne, David Cameron, and Theresa May, that marriage is we put our radical hats to one side. We said, marriage is a conservative value. If you believe in marriage, you will surely want more people to get married. If you believe in family life and stability and loyalty and commitment, you've got to support. And interestingly, that famous speech by David Cameron at the Conservative Party conference, I think was in 2011, it was almost word for word from the briefing that we sent him.
And it's the thing that he's now most famous for.
Yeah.
Well, apart from Brexit.
Yeah. But I'll tell you a funny little preamble of that. In the 2010 election campaign, the Conservatives had no LGBT plus policies. So we organised a picket of Conservative election headquarters, which was then at Millbank. Yeah. And the theme was, David Cameron, where are your LGBT plus policies? It got huge publicity. So as a result, I was called to a meeting with George Osborne and Theresa May, where we put out the case for marriage equality. And we left the meeting with the assurance that it'll be considered. We take our points, it will be considered. George Osborne's parting shot to me was, it's very nice to meet you again, Peter, after all these years. To which I looked at him startled and said, when was that? Oh, you came to my school and talked. It made me feel really ancient.
No, I've been hogging the conversation, and I know there are lots of questions that members of the audience have. I've got a few more questions for Peter at the end, but let's open up for questions. We've covered such a range of issues, but also there are so many things that we haven't touched on. So Peter has said he's very happy to answer any questions. So can we start with some students, please, first of all, because I'm keen to get, no pressure, of course, but younger voices and questions you might have for Peter and the breadth of his experience of activism. Please don't be bashful. Yeah, please.
Hiya. You obviously mentioned about the Green Party, and I just was wondering if you might be able to elaborate on the connections that you see between sort of environmental justice and obviously the wider pursuit of justice for everyone.
Did everybody hear that? I always say, what's the point of fighting for LGBT plus rights, or the rights of women or black people or anyone else, if we don't have a planet on which to practice them, enjoy them? So for me, the climate crisis is one of the great existential threats to humanity. And we're just seeing the very first signs of what might be a truly catastrophic future if we don't act quickly. So that's, to me, the connection. To me, it is a human rights issue because, NASA has predicted that on current projections of sea level rises and storm surges, that the Thames Barrier will not be able to hold back floodwaters in London, and that large parts of East and South London will disappear underwater. Large parts. We're talking about probably 2 million people losing their homes and workplaces if that happens. This is not scaremongering. These are NASA scientists looking at projections, and that's based upon rising sea levels in conjunction with storm surges up the Thames estuary, which they predict is a real likely threat. So that's why it's really important that we do lobby, pressure and campaign and live our own lives as green as possible.
Thanks for that talk. What is your view on the recent ruling that the ban on Palestine action was unlawful? And could you speak to the wider sort of case that the Labour Party has been sort of putting forward with that?
As you can probably see, on this lapel I wear a Ukraine solidarity badge, on this one a Palestine solidarity badge, but also with a yellow ribbon to express my solidarity for the victims of the Hamas attack on the 7th of October, the Jewish victims, all victims of that attack. For me, it is quite clear that Palestine Action, whatever they are not a terrorist organization on a par with Al-Qaeda or ISIS. That's just ridiculous. It's absurd. It's an insult to our intelligence to try and do that. And it does signify a very repressive trend in our society. The right to free speech and the right to protest is under attack. Under attack in very, very severe ways, and new draconian measures are coming in Labour's crime and policing bill, which will allow the police to ban what they call, quote, cumulative or repeat protests. I've been arrested at 2 Palestine protests in the last year, most recently just a couple of weeks ago. I just think the police are engaged in massive overreach. Palestine Action people are, whatever you think about them, they're brave. They're taking action to stop a greater crime against humanity. But they're putting their own lives and freedom in risk. Many of those people have been in prison on remand for over a year, jailed without charge or without a trial for over a year. That's incompatible with a democratic society. Even the government's own guidelines say that no one should be held on remand for more than 6 months. Palestine Action, I can't speak for them, but I think, if you think they've committed criminal damage, charge them with that crime. there is an offence of criminal damage, charge them. But don't pretend they're terrorists. That is monstrous. And we do have to take a stand against the way in which the law is being used to increasingly restrict the right to protest. If the current laws existed today, the suffragettes would have all been charged with terrorism, because they did acts of criminal damage too, fighting for a greater, higher value, the right of women to vote. And Palestine Action today, they, by damaging Elbit Systems factories and warehouses, they are trying to stop war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. They are acting as moral leaders of our society, moral leaders against the terrible abuses that Israel has perpetrated against Israeli civilians. 20,000 children murdered. 20,000 children murdered since Israel's attack. Now, I'm all in favor of Israel's right to self-defense. I condemn from the outset the Hamas attacks. I've been fighting against Hamas and exposing its human rights abuses ever since it was formed. You know, in recent years, I've been speaking out and exposing the killing by Hamas of Palestinians who disagree with its tyrannical rule. You know, the jailing of trade union leaders by Hamas, the beating and imprisonment of women who refuse to wear the hijab, the threats and beatings of LGBT plus people in Gaza, the lack of free speech, the lack of a right to protest in Gaza. Hamas is a tyranny, not just a terrorist organization, it's a tyranny against Palestinian people. And the Palestinian leadership, people like Marwan Barghouti, imprisoned by the Israelis since 2002, have spoken out against Hamas's attacks on Israeli civilians. Yes, the people of Palestine have a right to resist, but no one has the right to kill civilians. And no one has a right to persecute Palestinian people, whether they are Israel or Hamas.
I'm curious, given your past kind of work about the Church in England, what your thought is about the Church of England today, and whether or not the new Archbishop will be able to manage schisms and kind of the division, the collapse of their living in love and liberty, was last week. You know, what your thoughts are on where the Church of England stands today and whether it's really got better.
Well, I'd say compared to 40 years ago, the Church is somewhat improved. Progress, albeit hesitant and slow, but quite clearly last week's decision to drop proposals to even bless same-sex couples is an appalling setback. And it signifies the Church is still supporting discrimination. They won't even bless loving, committed same-sex relationships, let alone agree to marriage equality. The Church is a mess. The Church is on the wrong side of history. The Church is endorsing discrimination. And all power to those within the Church who are trying to change things, but I just think it's making the Church rightly more irrelevant than ever.
Thanks very much. So I want to ask a two-part question on the role of the UK in relation to the situation of queer people elsewhere. So overall, over 60 countries in the world still criminalize homosexuality, and about half of them are Commonwealth countries. So I think the first kind of element I want to ask you is, what do you think the UK's role is in trying to change that, not least given many of those laws are a legacy of colonial rule? And the second part is, what can the UK do more clearly than it does today to protect queer people when they seek asylum, including getting here in order to do so?
Well, first let me say the Commonwealth is a total sham and shame, not just on LGBT plus issues, but on all human rights issues. It has human rights values in the Commonwealth Charter, but it never enforces them. So just a couple of weeks ago, Uganda had another rigged election by the dictator Yoweri Museveni. All the Commonwealth could do was do tut-tut. No suspension of Uganda, no sanctions, Nothing. And it's the same across the board. The Commonwealth countries, many of them have the death penalty, restrictions on freedom of the press, severe curtailment of freedom of speech, the right to form trade unions, the right to protest. The Commonwealth is a repository of human rights abuses. And LGBT plus abuses are just part and parcel of that wide spectrum. Do you know that in the 70 years the Commonwealth has existed, the Commonwealth heads of government has never once even discussed LGBT plus human rights. They've refused point blank. Every time a member state raises it, they block it. They won't even allow an LGBT plus person to address the Commonwealth heads of government meeting. They won't have a private meeting with an LGBT plus person. I have tried for over 40 years to get LGBT plus rights on the Commonwealth heads of government agenda with others. Every time it's been vetoed. I tried to get, some years ago, Desmond Tutu, the former Archbishop of South Africa, a great anti-apartheid hero, to address them as a black African churchman on LGBT plus issues. They wouldn't allow him to speak. It's just, I hate to say it, but the Commonwealth is a waste of time. It does a few little good things here and there, but it's basically just window dressing and a talking shop.
And the second question, in terms of Britain's role in relation to queer asylum seekers?
Just to finish off the last point, there's nothing much that Britain can do. We are not a colonial power anymore. We can't dictate. What we can do, and what is sometimes done, is supporting and amplifying the voices of people in Commonwealth countries. So Stonewall and others have in the past, I don't know if it's still doing it, occasionally have training sessions for LGBT plus activists in Commonwealth countries.
And I was involved in the Human Dignity Trust, which does exactly the same in terms of...
So teach them how to use the media, how to organise, how to campaign. That's fantastic. But ultimately, change has to come from within. In terms of asylum, again, the whole asylum system is rotten from start to finish. It's based on the presumption that everyone's a faker, and there are some false claims, but I think my foundation, we've helped well over 300 people gain asylum in Britain over the last decade or so. There's only one person I had any doubts about, can't prove it, but all the others absolutely genuine, and they've continued to do great work supporting others. We helped them get them asylum, they've repaid by helping others get asylum. But the idea that people fleeing persecution should be put in an asylum detention centre is outrageous. That just reinforces their trauma and their pain and suffering. And as you probably saw recently, there's been a report which came out which showed that the Home Office is failing to protect LGBT plus people in asylum detention centres, where they're often subjected to abuse, threats, and even violence from staff as well as other detained persons. That's got to change. We also, of course, need to change the system where those who are put into Home Office designated hostels aren't forced to share accommodation with homophobic people who threaten and abuse them. And we've had plenty of experience in the people we've helped of them being put into accommodation where they're being terrorized by other people who are also refugees, but who hate them and threaten them and even beat them up because they're LGBT+. That has got to change. But, we have to get the pressure, but it's shameful that all these things have been told to the Home Office over and over again for 20 or 30 years, and they're still not listening and acting.
A few quick fire final questions. Yes, please. If you could make your question really short, and then we'll...
Hi, thank you for this evening. It's been great. Would you, in today's political climate, still encourage activists to enter politics? Or do you think there's another way round that might be more influential?
I think there's always a movement, always a role for movements outside of Parliament, because often Parliament's the last place to get the message. So pressure groups and lobbying groups are really, really important. If you want to do it that way, that's fine. If you want to go into mainstream politics, that's also fine. I think the two are complementary.
I think it follows from the last question. So I'm really struck by how unsentimentally you've talked about your own bravery. And I wonder, given that we're at a moment that's requiring bravery of citizens in a variety of places, I'm thinking of Minneapolis in particular, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your understanding of what conditions produce bravery, so that we don't think of it just as a biographical experience, but actually as something that we can understand historically and that we can try and understand as emergent around us.
Well, let me say that when I went to Russia, I think 4 or 5 times, and got very badly beaten up, arrested 3 times, I was terrified. I was afraid. But I just had the hope that with a Western passport, the punishment wouldn't be too severe. When I went to Qatar, in 2022 for the Football World Cup, I was terrified. People warned me you could get a week, a month, a year in prison for staging a protest there. But in both cases, I thought to myself, well, people there would suffer something far, far worse. I wanted to give a voice to their concerns that were not being heard. I want to, say the things that they couldn't, the things they asked me to say, but they couldn't because the risks were too great. And I suppose always I've thought to myself, well, yeah, I've taken some risks and, I'm scared, but compared to human rights defenders in Iran or Saudi Arabia or Russia or China, the risks for me are pretty small. So I have a duty to do what I can. And fortunately, I've not had anything too severe happen to me. I've never been in prison long term. I have been quite badly beaten up by Mugabe's bodyguards in Brussels in 2001. I've got a bit of cognitive and eye damage as a result. But hey, I'm still here, I can still function. By comparison, people in Zimbabwe were murdered, were raped. So I got off lightly. And that's what having that sort of sense of perspective, that keeps me going.
Thanks ever so much for such an inspiring conversation. It's been fantastic. I got a trivial question to start just on you in comparison contrary to the bravery side, you've also spoken a bit about the comedy and the playfulness in activism. Could you just highlight some of that as well, because it seems to have played somewhat of a role in the way you've done things in terms of smart exposure of hypocrisy. But the other one is really, with the rise that we have at the moment of the extraordinary inequality economic inequality over the last 40 years, and its relationship to the loss of public trust, which is also to an extent leading to the rise of the far right. To what extent do you see ways in which, the kind of alliances that you've spoken about can actually come together to speak to counter some of that over the next period?
There's only one thing Reform UK has ever said that I agree with. And that was the recent statement, the Equality Act is flawed because it doesn't include social class. The biggest, greatest inequality in our society. I can remember campaigning to get class and income included within the Equality Act, and it was blocked.
And I have to say that I completely agree, and as chair of the EHRC, that was one of the things I spent most of my time pushing for.
The playful thing. Well, just to give you an example, in the days of outrage, even in the early 1990s, the police were still arresting and prosecuting same-sex couples for merely kissing. That was regarded as public indecency or disorder. So after 2 lesbians were arrested and successfully prosecuted for giving each other a goodnight kiss at Victoria Railway Station, we decided, in outrage, to do a mass kiss-in and challenge the police to arrest us. So we set up this kiss-in in Piccadilly Circus, I think it was 1991, where we got about 200 couples to pledge to kiss in defiance of the police's interpretation of the law, because in fact there was no actual specific law that banned it. They were using the Public Order Act and so on. We got lots of publicity in the weeks beforehand. We trailed this for about 2 or 3 weeks beforehand, telling the stories of those 2 lesbians and others who'd been victimized, a goodnight kiss at a bus stop, a goodnight kiss outside a gay bar or club, and got masses and masses of really great coverage telling our story, really embarrassing for the Metropolitan Police. So the great upshot was that 1 hour before that kiss-in, I got a message from, I think then Sir Paul Condon, the then Metropolitan Police Commissioner, saying that from that moment onwards, no same-sex couples would be arrested. So we won before we even began the kiss-in. So the kiss-in was a great celebration. And it was a lot of fun.
Final question, what advice have you got for our young people here after a career of bravery and activism? What would you say? Because these are people, young people who are facing a dangerous, difficult, challenging, economically challenging world, as we just discussed. What advice have you got?
All the rights and freedoms we have, which are now under attack, they were won by people who went before us. We inherited the results of their struggles. So it's really important that we each do something. It may not be the crazy things that I do. It could just be a simple thing like writing to a member of Parliament, going to a lobby of Parliament, marching in a protest. Whatever it is, do something. Don't leave it to others, because they may be leaving it to you. So do something, big or small. I always mention the writetothem.com website. Writetothem.com website. If you go to that website, put in your postcode, it will give you the name and email addresses of your Member of Parliament and your local councillors. If you're in London or another big metropolitan district, the members of your local regional assembly. And you can email them directly about whatever issue concerns you. It's simple, but MPs always say, if they get 10 or 20 emails about a single subject, they start to get worried because they think 10 or 20 people have written, but maybe there's probably 100, 200, 300 others who feel the same. And when it comes to an election and votes, they want all your votes. So that's a really simple thing to do. But, join an organization like Amnesty International, support LGBT plus groups, whatever you do, do something, because activism equals change.
Peter, thank you so much for the conversation. It's been absolutely fascinating. I think what shines through is not just your bravery, your intelligence in relation to how you approach these really challenging and difficult issues, your persistence, but also your optimism. And I just want to take the opportunity to thank you for everything that you've done. We haven't always approached it in the same way, but I think it's been very complimentary, and just carry on doing everything that you're doing and speaking out. And I hope all the young people in the room and all the less than young people in the room continue to do exactly what Peter is urging us to do. So can I ask you to show your appreciation in the usual way, please?